Whispers of a vanished army. The desert keeps its secrets well. Even today, when satellites sweep the skies and historians comb archives online, there are still places where the past whispers louder than the present. One of those whispers comes from the vast steppes and deserts of Central Asia, a whisper of an army that marched east and never came back. An army of Rome. Not a handful of wandering merchants, not a delegation of envoys, not a lone adventurer lost on the Silk Road. No, this is the legend of thousands of men in bronze and iron, drilled to march in perfect rhythm, hardened by battles in the burning east. A Roman legion, or at least what remained of one, disappearing into the folds of history and reappearing, strangely, in chronicles of a civilization Rome itself never knew existed: Han China. It sounds impossible. And perhaps, in some ways, it is. But history is a tapestry woven not only of facts but of gaps that beg to be filled with speculation, possibility, and imagination. And this story, the story of Rome's lost army in China, is one of those gaps that has haunted scholars and storytellers alike. The first echoes. The whispers begin in the Chinese annals. Somewhere around 36 BCE, in the dry and bitter frontiers of the Han Empire, Chinese generals recorded a strange encounter. During a campaign against a Central Asian warlord, their soldiers faced an enemy that fought unlike any they had seen before. These warriors arranged themselves in what the Chinese scribes called a fish-scale formation. Shields overlapping, moving as one, pushing forward with relentless discipline. This was not the way nomads fought. Steppe horsemen relied on speed, arrows, and chaos. But these men, these strangers, stood like walls of iron. The Han armies eventually crushed the fortress where they stood. Those strange soldiers, whoever they were scattered or captured. But the record survives: dry and clinical foreign warriors, disciplined, unusual, unlike tribes of the steppe. To most readers at the time, it meant nothing. But to modern historians, those two words, fish-scale formation, jump off the page. To Roman ears, it sounds eerily familiar. Could it have been the testudo, the famous tortoise formation of the legions? A wall of shields, interlocked, protecting men from arrows above and spears in front. And if so, how in the world did Romans get here on the edge of China, nearly 7,000 kilometers from Rome itself? The desert of forgotten men. The most obvious place to look for answers is Carrhae. The year was 53 BCE. Rome was still a republic, tearing itself apart with ambition and rivalry. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, hungered for glory to match Caesar in Gaul and Pompey in the Mediterranean. Against all advice, he marched east, dreaming of conquering the Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient nemesis, master of the Iranian plains. It was disaster. At Carrhae, Roman legions met the Parthian cavalry. Armored horsemen and endless flights of arrows shredded the disciplined squares of Rome. Parthian horse archers rained death on men who could not close the distance. Legionaries collapsed in the desert heat, pierced through shields and armor, their discipline breaking in the sand. Crassus himself was killed, his body desecrated. 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. But another 10,000, an entire army's worth, were not killed at all. They were captured. And here is where the trail of whispers begins. The Parthians were known not simply to kill prisoners, but to use them. They resettled captives far away from their homelands, scattering them across their empire as laborers, mercenaries, border guards. Some Roman prisoners are believed to have been marched eastward thousands of kilometers into lands Rome barely knew existed. What happened to them? Did they vanish into the dust of history, absorbed into local tribes, their Latin tongue forgotten, their shields thrown aside? Or did some of them keep marching further and further east until one day Chinese scribes would notice their strange fish-scale walls? The mystery of Liqian. Centuries later, in the province of Gansu, there grew a village called Lixian. Travelers who passed through were startled by what they saw. Tall men with aquiline noses, some with lighter eyes, some with hair that did not resemble their neighbors. The locals claimed descent from soldiers who had come from the far west, a land across deserts and mountains, so far away that few even dared speak its name. To modern ears, the story is irresistible. Could Lixian be the last echo of a Roman settlement in China? Could those villagers be descendants of Crassus's lost legion, transplanted from the deserts of Syria to the high plateaus of Asia? Genetic studies have complicated the story. Some show traces of European ancestry, though not enough to prove a direct Roman origin. Others argue that Central Asia has always been a crossroads where Persians, Greeks, Turks, and Chinese intermingled for centuries. To pin everything on Rome might be too convenient. And yet the legend endures. Lixian has embraced it, turning Roman soldiers into a kind of identity. Tourists arrive to see supposed descendants of Rome's lost sons. Local businesses sell the idea Chinese Romans. The myth is alive, whether or not the DNA can confirm it. Rome and China, two worlds almost touched. Part of what makes this legend so haunting is the sheer romance of it. Rome and China, two of the greatest empires of antiquity, stood at opposite ends of the known world. Each had vast armies, immense wealth, emperors who claimed divine favor, bureaucracies that could move grain, men, and messages across thousands of kilometers. And yet, they never met. They knew of each other in whispers. Chinese records mention Da Qin, a distant empire in the far west, wealthy and powerful. Roman writers speak vaguely of the Saras, a people who produced silk of unimaginable fineness. Traders carried goods between them, but the middlemen, the Parthians, the Kushans, the steppe nomads kept them apart, controlling the flow of wealth. For the most part, Rome and Han China were like two great beasts in a forest, each hearing the other's footsteps, each sensing the presence of something vast, but never coming face to face. And yet, if the story of the lost legion is true, then Rome did not vanish entirely at the Euphrates. It marched further silently until it brushed the edge of China itself. The power of a story. It is important to remember, we do not know. The evidence is thin. A single phrase in Chinese annals. A scattering of unusual faces in a far-off village. Legends that grew with the telling. Many historians are skeptical. Perhaps the fish scale formation was not Roman at all, but a coincidence. Perhaps Lixian's unusual features came from other migrations. Perhaps Rome never made it past Parthia at all. But still, the story refuses to die. Because it asks a question that is larger than the facts: what happens when history's mightiest empire loses men to the sands? Where do they go? And what stories do they carry with them? For centuries, the Roman legion was a symbol of order, discipline, and power. The idea that one of those legions might have disappeared into the wilderness of Asia, that its standards might have waved in a foreign wind, its soldiers staring up at stars unfamiliar to them, is a haunting one. And so, we begin our story not with certainty but with curiosity. With the possibility that history is not a closed book, but a half-burned scroll. That somewhere, in the deserts of Central Asia, Rome left behind an echo. An echo the Chinese remembered when they saw men fighting in a formation unlike any other. An echo that villagers in Lixian still whisper about today. An echo that reminds us that even the mightiest empires cannot control the destiny of every soldier who marches beneath their banners. Setting the stage. The story of Rome's lost army in China is not a simple tale. It is not a neat narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a puzzle scattered across three empires: Rome, Parthia, and Han China. In the chapters to come, we will trace that puzzle piece by piece. We will stand on the sands of Carrhae, where Rome's pride turned to ash. We will follow prisoners on forced marches through desert and steppe. We will enter the fortress of Carrhae, where foreign soldiers baffled Chinese scribes. We will walk the lanes of Lycion, where whispers of Roman ancestry still echo. And we will ask the questions that history cannot quite answer. How far did Rome's reach truly extend? Could a legion really have survived so far from home? And why does this story captivate us still, thousands of years later? The desert at dusk. Imagine for a moment the desert at dusk. The sun sinking, the sand glowing red, the horizon endless. A column of men marches, not merchants, not nomads, but soldiers. They carry shields, worn thin from use. Their sandals are patched. Their helmets dented. They march in silence eastward toward lands none of them had ever dreamed of. Behind them lies Rome, a world they will never see again. Ahead of them lies China, a world they cannot yet imagine. Somewhere in the middle, in the shifting sands of history, they vanish. And it is here between fact and legend, between certainty and myth, that our story begins. Chapter 1: The Might of Rome and the Edge of Empire. History is full of battles. Some are won, some are lost, and most are eventually forgotten. But when Rome lost, the world noticed. To understand how an entire army could vanish into the deserts of Asia, we need to begin not with the disappearance, but with Rome itself, its soldiers, its ambitions, and its hunger for glory. Only then can we see how pride turned into catastrophe, and catastrophe into legend. The machine of empire. Rome's armies were not mere mobs of fighters, they were machines of flesh and iron. Every legion was built on discipline, drilled until man and formation were indistinguishable. Picture it: 5,000 men, divided into cohorts and centuries, each commanded by officers who could read the slightest tremor of a man's shield or the smallest break in a line. A legion was more than an army, it was a living organism. Legionaries were not peasants dragged unwillingly into war. They were professionals, men who signed up for 20 years of service, knowing they might never see home again. They trained daily, throwing pila, those heavy Roman javelins designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back, practicing shield drills until their arms shook, marching miles upon miles in full armor. A single soldier carried nearly 30 kilograms of equipment: helmet, shield, sword, dagger, armor, rations, stakes for camp fortifications. The Romans were sometimes mocked as muli Mariani, Marius's mules, after the general who reformed the army in the late Republic. But the insult was truth. Roman soldiers could carry their world on their backs. The Romans knew the key to war was not always brilliance, but endurance. They could march where others starved. They could dig where others refused. And above all, they could hold the line. Against Gauls, Germans, Carthaginians, this machine had proven itself invincible. But the eastern deserts were different. Rome turns east. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer a scrappy republic clinging to the hills of Italy. It was a world power, spreading its arms across the Mediterranean. Greece was theirs. Spain, theirs. Carthage lay in ashes. Egypt was in the palm of Cleopatra, an ally or rival, depending on the day. And now, Rome's gaze turned eastward, across the Euphrates River, into the lands of Persia. For centuries, Persia had been the other giant. From the days of Cyrus and Darius, through the wars with Alexander the Great, the Iranian plateau had produced empires of vast wealth and cunning strategy. In Rome's day, the Parthians ruled a people of horsemen, masters of the bow, descended from nomads of the steppe. For Rome, Parthia was both an opportunity and a humiliation. Opportunity, because conquering it would open trade routes to India and beyond, filling Roman coffers with silk, spices, and jewels. Humiliation, because Parthia was the one frontier Rome had never truly mastered. Julius Caesar had dreamed of conquering them. Pompey had skirmished with them. But it was Marcus Licinius Crassus, wealthiest man in Rome, who staked everything on an invasion. Crassus, the hungry man. Crassus was not born for glory. He was not Caesar, with his dazzling charm and literary brilliance. He was not Pompey, adored by the masses. Crassus was practical, calculating, and above all, hungry. His wealth was legendary. He owned mines, properties, and whole swaths of Rome. He bought burning buildings just to rebuild them, profiting on disaster. Yet in Rome, wealth was never enough. Without military glory, a man's name meant little in the Senate. So in 53 BCE, when he marched east with 7 legions, around 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 4,000 light troops, he carried not only Rome's ambitions, but his own desperate need to stand shoulder to shoulder with Caesar and Pompey. It was hubris, and it would cost tens of thousands of men their lives. The edge of empire. The Euphrates River was more than a geographical boundary. It was a cultural one. On one side, Rome's cities of stone, roads stretching across provinces, farmers, senators, gladiators, and legions. On the other, Parthia, open plains, mounted warriors, nomadic traditions woven into empire. The Romans expected a war like those they had fought before: pitched battles, walls of infantry, sieges of cities. Instead, they met something utterly alien. The Parthians did not need walls. Their walls were horses. Their arrows were endless. And so, at a place called Carrhae, where the Mesopotamian desert stretches wide and cruel, Rome's machine met Parthia's swarm. The Battle of Carrhae. The Roman legions advanced, shields polished, standards high. Crassus believed numbers and discipline would carry the day. Then came the drums of the Parthians. Then the thunder of hooves. Then the whine of arrows slicing through the air. Parthian cavalry encircled the Romans, firing from a distance. When Roman soldiers tried to close ranks, arrows rained down. When they tried to advance, the horsemen simply retreated, firing backwards, an ancient trick known as the Parthian shot. The Roman shields bristled with arrows. Men fell choking in the dust, their armor pierced again and again. And when the legionaries thought the Parthians must be running out of ammunition, they realized the horror caravans of camels carried fresh supplies. The arrows would not stop. For hours the Romans bled in the sun. They could neither flee nor advance. The desert swallowed their strength. Crassus faltered. His officers bickered. Confusion spread. By nightfall, the Romans were broken. 20,000 lay dead. Another 10,000 were dragged away in chains. The prisoners rode. For Rome, Carrhae was a humiliation so deep it shook the Republic. For the captured soldiers, it was the beginning of a journey almost unimaginable. The Parthians were pragmatic. Killing so many trained soldiers was wasteful. Better to use them. So they resettled the Romans far from their homeland, scattering them across the eastern provinces. Some were forced to guard borders against nomads. Others were absorbed into local garrisons. Ancient sources hint that groups of these prisoners were marched thousands of kilometers eastward. Some historians suggest they were sent to Margiana, near modern Turkmenistan, a frontier land where Parthia needed defenders. Here, in a place of steppe and desert, these Romans may have fought again, not for the eagle of Rome but for survival under Parthian command. Here, they might have adopted new languages, married locals, and slowly lost their old identities. But perhaps not all of them. Perhaps some remained soldiers, clinging to their discipline, their formations, their way of war. And perhaps those are the men the Chinese later saw. The world beyond Rome. To a Roman soldier marched east in chains, the world must have seemed endless. Beyond Parthia lay lands of which they had never heard. The Silk Road stretched like a scar across deserts and mountains, linking worlds that Rome only dimly imagined. For the Han Chinese, Rome was Da Qin, a distant, powerful kingdom across mountains and sands. For the Romans, China was a rumor, a place where silk came from, its people vague shadows called the Saras. Neither empire could grasp the other fully. But the prisoners of Carrhae may have walked that road with their own feet. Not as ambassadors, not as traders, but as slaves of war. It is here, in this no-man's land between empires, that the legend of the Lost Legion takes root. Discipline without a home. Why does the story linger? Because Roman discipline was unlike anything else in the world at the time. Steppe nomads fought as individuals, their arrows loosed in chaos. Eastern kingdoms fought with cavalry, swift and sharp. But the Romans, wherever they went, brought the wall. Shield beside shield, sword behind sword, each man part of the machine. To see such a formation in Central Asia, in the heart of the steppe, would be like seeing a ghost. Chinese scribes could find no words except fish-scale formation men, locking shields until they gleamed like scales of a living creature. It is not proof, but it is a tantalizing echo. The edge of a mystery. And so we return to the question, how did Rome's sons end up brushing against China's empire? The simplest answer is, they did not. The Chinese fish scale could have been another tactic, developed locally, or borrowed from another people. The villagers of Lycian may simply be one more example of Central Asia's genetic crossroads. The Romans may have died in Parthia, their story swallowed in silence. But simplicity is not always satisfying. And history is rarely simple. Somewhere between the deserts of Mesopotamia and the valleys of Gansu lies the truth. A truth buried beneath sand, lost in burned scrolls, scattered in the bones of forgotten men. All we know for certain is this: Rome's might reached the edge of empire and broke. And when it broke, the pieces scattered further than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2: Survivors in the Sands. The battlefield at Carrhae was not a grave. It was a wound. Tens of thousands of Romans lay dead in the Mesopotamian sun, their bodies stripped by Parthian soldiers, their shields and swords carted off as trophies. But for 10,000 others, Carrhae was not the end. It was the beginning of exile. Defeat in Rome was usually final. A man who surrendered was often executed or sold in chains across the Mediterranean. But the Parthians were practical rulers. They understood that men were resources as valuable as horses or gold. And so, the prisoners of Carrhae were not slaughtered. They were absorbed. Thus begins the story of the survivors, the men who carried the eagle of Rome into the desert and who would march unwillingly further east than any Roman before them. The long road east. The Parthians had no interest in keeping their captives near Mesopotamia, where Roman armies might one day attempt a rescue. Instead, they pushed them far away, deep into the empire's eastern provinces. Some sources suggest they were marched to Margiana, near modern-day Merv in Turkmenistan. Margiana was a frontier land, fertile but vulnerable, where nomadic tribes threatened from beyond the Oxus River. What better way to guard the front than to station thousands of disciplined soldiers there, men who could build, dig, and fight, even if they now fought under compulsion? We can only imagine the march. Thousands of kilometers through searing desert. Men chained, exhausted, surviving on meager rations. Those who fell behind likely never rose again. The Romans who had once marched proudly with standards flying now trudged eastward like shadows of themselves. But they were still soldiers. And soldiers adapt. Romans in a foreign land. Once settled, the Romans would have been put to work. Parthian frontiers needed defenders. Fortresses needed building. Fields needed tending. The Parthians were clever enough to see the value of Roman discipline. These were men who could dig ditches, raise ramparts, and march in formation without hesitation. It is likely that the prisoners were used both as laborers and as mercenaries, guarding against raids by nomadic tribes like the Saka or the Yuezhi. To the locals, they must have seemed strange. Men speaking a foreign tongue, their skin burned by the Mediterranean sun, their shields and helmets unlike any seen in Central Asia. Some may have intermarried, taken local wives, raised children who spoke a mixture of Latin and Persian. Slowly, a Roman identity would have faded. But the muscle memory of formation, of shield and sword, does not vanish so easily. A new life under Parthia. What would life have looked like for these men? Language Latin would have been their mother tongue, but they would have been forced to learn some Aramaic or Persian to survive. Orders from Parthian officers would demand obedience, and survival depended on understanding. Religion. They had carried the gods of Rome into the desert, but shrines are hard to maintain in exile. Perhaps they whispered prayers to Jupiter in the night, or perhaps, over time, they honored local deities, blending rituals into something new. Identity. Did they still call themselves Romans? Or did they become something else, soldiers without a country, loyal to whoever fed them? We do not know. But history offers clues. In later centuries, many captured soldiers scattered across empires left faint traces of their Roman ways. A tomb here, with inscriptions in Latin letters. A village there, with techniques of fortification or farming unknown to locals. Perhaps the men of Carrhae did the same. Mercenaries of the frontier. The Parthians needed them most on the edge of empire. Beyond Margiana lay chaos. Nomadic tribes swept down from the steppes, raiding towns, threatening caravans along the Silk Road. The Parthians could not patrol every inch of land. But they could station foreign soldiers in vulnerable spots, men with no loyalty to the locals, men who would fight because they had no choice. This is how empires survive, by moving people like chess pieces across the board, erasing their roots and planting them in new soil. The Romans of Carrhae became pawns in the Parthian game. And yet, there are whispers faint, uncertain that they did not stay there forever. That in time, they were moved again. Further east, always further. A clash of worlds. To the west, their homeland burned with civil war. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey fled. The Republic tore itself apart. In Rome, their names were forgotten, their absence swallowed by greater dramas. But in the East, their story was not finished. When the Parthians faced threats beyond their own frontiers, they may have sent their Roman captives even further, into Central Asia, to fight as mercenaries against new enemies. Some suggest that groups of these soldiers ended up in Bactria, or even beyond, skirmishing near the edges of Han influence. Here is where history begins to blur. Chinese chronicles mention foreign warriors fighting for Central Asian kings. They describe strange formations, shields interlocked like scales, men who fought not as scattered bands but as a wall. Could these have been the survivors of Carrhae, decades older, hardened by exile, still clinging to the only thing they knew, the discipline of the legion? Life as the forgotten. Imagine the mind of a Roman soldier in exile. You were trained to fight for the Senate and the people of Rome. You carried the eagle standard, symbol of empire. You marched with comrades whose families farmed the same hills as yours. Now, you stand on the ramparts of a Parthian fortress, guarding against tribes you do not understand, speaking words that feel clumsy in your mouth, eating food that tastes strange. Rome is a memory. Your comrades are scattered. And you do not know if you will ever see Italy again. Some must have despaired. Others adapted. A few may have even thrived. But in every man's heart must have burned the knowledge that they had become ghosts of their former selves, soldiers without a nation. The Silk Road's silent travelers. The Silk Road was not a single highway, but a web of routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Caravans of camels carried silk, spices, jade, gold, and stories. Alongside the traders marched soldiers, guides, translators, and wanderers. It is here, along these dusty paths, that the Romans may have been swept further east. Not as free men, but as baggage of empire. In time, some of them or their children could have crossed into lands under Chinese influence. Perhaps they were hired by local kings. Perhaps they were captured again, taken as spoils from one master to another. Each transfer blurred their identity further. From Roman to Parthian mercenary to Central Asian wanderer, until at last, in Chinese eyes, they were simply foreign soldiers fighting in an unusual way. Echoes of discipline. The most enduring clue comes back to the fish scale formation described in Chinese records during the Battle of Carrhae in 36 BCE. By then, it had been nearly 20 years since Carrhae. Any Romans who survived would have been older men, perhaps in their 40s or 50s. But discipline does not age as quickly as flesh. A soldier drilled in the legion never forgets how to lock a shield, how to stand shoulder to shoulder. And when Chinese armies saw it, they recognized it as something utterly foreign. Not the wild charges of nomads, not the scattered bravery of tribes, but the living wall of Rome. Forgotten by Rome. What makes this story haunting is how silent Rome is about it. In Rome's histories, Carrhae is remembered as a disaster, but the prisoners vanish from the page. No records described their fate. No senators debated their rescue. Crassus's death overshadowed everything, and in the chaos of civil war, 10,000 missing men were a footnote at best. For their families, there may have been rumors, whispers, but no certainty. A son, a father, a brother marched east and never returned. In time, their names were carved on tombstones as if they had died in the desert. Rome forgot them. But China remembered something. Not their names, not their homeland, but the way they fought, the discipline in their bones. The sands keep their secrets. The story of the survivors is one of silence punctuated by whispers. A march to Margiana. Service as frontier guards. Possible transfers further east. The faint echo of their tactics in Chinese chronicles. The sands of Central Asia swallowed the rest. No Roman helmets have been unearthed in Turkmenistan, no Latin inscriptions in Gansu. The evidence is elusive. And yet the idea persists. Because history is not only about what is certain, but about what is possible. Between fact and legend. Were the survivors of Carrhae truly the men who fought at Carrhae? Were they the ancestors of villagers in Lycian? Or did they vanish quietly, absorbed into the endless churn of Central Asian migrations? We cannot know. But the possibility that they survived, that they carried the memory of Rome into lands Rome itself never saw, is enough to keep the story alive. The human thread. History often remembers emperors and generals. But this story is about soldiers, ordinary men caught in the machinery of empire. They were not decision-makers. They did not choose to march into Parthia. They did not choose exile. And yet, their footsteps may have carried Roman discipline across mountains and deserts, leaving traces where no Roman citizen ever intended to tread. It is the human thread that makes the mystery compelling. 10,000 men, forgotten by their own people, remembered only in faint whispers of another civilization. Their story is not written in marble but in speculation, rumor, and the haunting silence of absence. The stage ahead. In the chapters that follow, we will step deeper into this mystery. We will examine the Han Empire and the ways it brushed against Rome without ever meeting. We will study the Battle of Carrhae, where foreign soldiers left their faint mark on Chinese history. We will walk the streets of Lycian, where legend and identity blur. For now, we leave the survivors in the sands, marching east, step by step, into the unknown. They began as legionaries of Rome. By the time history glimpses them again, they are something else, soldiers without a name, Shadow the Lost Legion. Chapter 3. Rome's World, China's World. When we think of Rome and China, we imagine two worlds apart, separated by deserts, mountains, and silence. Yet in the 1st century BCE, these two empires were the brightest flames on earth, civilizations so powerful that their shadows stretched across continents. They never truly met, but they sensed one another, like two great beasts pacing on opposite sides of forest, each aware of the other's weight without ever clashing. To understand the mystery of the lost Roman soldiers in China, we must step back and see the stage upon which their story unfolded: the world of Rome, the world of Han China, and the fragile thread of trade and rumor that linked them. The heart of Rome. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had grown far beyond the city of 7 hills. Its empire encircled the Mediterranean, what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The city of marble and dust. Rome itself was a contradiction, grandeur and squalor side by side. Senators strutted in gleaming togas, while slaves labored in the streets. Temples towered over alleys where beggars slept. Amphitheaters roared with the blood of gladiators, while libraries held the wisdom of Greece. At its heart was power. The Senate debated, generals plotted, and the people rioted when their grain rations faltered. Rome was a city where ambition could raise a man to godhood or plunge him into ruin overnight. The Roman way. Rome's strength was its order. Roads paved the provinces, aqueducts carried water across valleys, laws bound citizens in a web of rights and duties. The legion stood as both sword and symbol, an iron guarantee that Rome's will could be enforced from Spain to Syria. And yet, even at its height, Rome was restless. Its leaders were never content. Expansion was glory. Conquest was proof of divine favor. And so, Rome pushed outward, to the north against Gauls, to the west against Iberians, and to the east against Parthia. The heart of China. Far across the world, another empire thrived. In the east, the Han dynasty ruled with a reach and order to rival Rome's. The Han vision. Founded after the collapse of the Qin, the Han dynasty had, by the 1st century BCE, unified much of China under a central authority. From the fertile plains of the Yellow River to the subtropical south, from the Korean peninsula to the deserts of the west, the Han emperor's writ ran wide. The Han bureaucracy was intricate, staffed by scholar officials who had studied the Confucian classics. Where Rome's Senate was filled with aristocrats, the Han valued merit, or at least the appearance of it. Examinations, records, and officials in every province kept the empire humming. The Han people. Like Rome, China was a land of contrasts. Great walled cities bustled with markets, artisans, and scholars, while farmers in distant villages tilled the soil with little awareness of the empire's grandeur. Soldiers patrolled the borders, where nomadic tribes like the Xiongnu pressed constantly against the frontier. To the Han, order was everything. The emperor was the son of heaven, ruling not just by force but by cosmic mandate. If he ruled well, heaven blessed the land with harvests. If he faltered, disasters and rebellions were taken as signs that heaven's favor had shifted. Parallels across the world. The similarities between Rome and Han China are striking. Both built vast road networks, enabling the flow of goods, armies, and information. Both relied on a disciplined military, professionalized and loyal to the state. Both balanced immense central power with the constant threat of rebellion and corruption. Infrastructure: Roman roads and Chinese canals, each stitched together enormous territories. Law and order: Rome codified law in statutes and precedents. China codified morality through Confucian ritual and imperial edicts. Economy: both empires thrived on agriculture, taxing the peasants who formed the backbone of society, while long-distance trade brought luxury goods. Enemies: Rome feared Parthians and Germanic tribes. China feared the Xiongnu and nomads of the steppe. It is as if, on opposite ends of the world, two experiments in civilization had grown independently, mirror images in some ways, utterly alien in others. The thread of silk. If Rome and Han China were so similar, why did they not meet? The answer lies in the geography between them: deserts, mountains, and empires who controlled the middle ground. The Parthians in particular served as gatekeepers. They stood between Rome and China, taxing and controlling the flow of goods along the Silk Road. For Parthia, secrecy was profit. The fewer details Rome and China knew about each other, the more valuable the trade became. And so, silk from China reached Rome without ever being traced to its true source. Roman women draped themselves in shimmering garments, their husbands muttering that silk weakened Roman virtue. Meanwhile, in China, whispers spoke of a land called Da-Qin, wealthy, distant, ruled by kings. Goods traveled. Ideas traveled. But men rarely did. Rome's glimpses of China. Roman authors wrote vaguely of the Sers, the Silk people. They imagined them as strange and semi-mythical, living at the farthest edge of the world. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century essay, spoke of silk as combed from the leaves of trees by these mysterious people. Others described them as noble, honest traders so far away that their goods passed through countless hands before reaching the empire. For most Romans, the idea of China was less geography than dream and exotic elsewhere where the world's finest treasures were born. China's glimpses of Rome. Chinese sources were more specific. They knew of Da-Qin, described in the Hao Han Shu book of the later Han, as a great empire far to the west. The text marvels at their cities, their tall people, their fine goods. But the knowledge was fragmentary. Traders were not eager to reveal the full truth, for mystery made their cargo more valuable. And so, Da-Qin was a shadow empire, half real, half imagined. A world of intermediaries. Between Rome and China lay a mosaic of powers: the Parthians, the Kushan Empire, the steppe nomads. Each acted as both barrier and bridge. Caravans might begin in China, carrying silk and lacquerware, then pass into Central Asia, where Sogdian merchants traded them further west. Eventually they reached Parthian hands, then Armenian, then Syrian, until at last they appeared in Roman markets. It was a game of whispers. By the time goods crossed this vast chain, their origins were obscured. A Roman might hold silk without knowing it came from mulberry-fed worms in China. A Chinese noble might admire glass without knowing it came from Roman furnaces. The great almost. This is what makes the story of the lost Roman legions so captivating: the idea that, for once, men, not just goods, bridged the gap. Imagine it. For centuries, Rome and China circled each other at a distance, never quite touching. And then, suddenly, in the records of Han generals appears the faint trace of something Roman soldiers in formation, shields interlocked. It is as if two stars that never crossed suddenly flickered with a shared light. Why they never met? Historians have long asked, why didn't Rome and China make direct contact? The answer is partly distance. Between them stretched nearly 7,000 kilometers of hostile terrain, deserts like the Taklamakan, mountains like the Pamirs, endless steppes where nomads raided constantly. Even with caravans, the journey could take years. It is also politics. The Parthians jealously guarded their role as middlemen, discouraging direct contact. For Rome, conquest eastward was checked by the disaster at Carrhae. For China, expeditions westward were costly, stretching supply lines to the breaking point. And so each empire remained at the edge of the other's imagination, never more than rumor. The human factor. Yet individuals did cross. Traders, adventurers, exiles. A Roman envoy once reached as far as India, perhaps brushing close to Chinese merchants. Chinese envoy sent by Zhang Qian centuries earlier reported distant lands that might have been echoes of the West. And then, perhaps there were the survivors of Carrhae, men dragged not by choice but by fate, carried eastward step by step until they stood face to face with China's soldiers. Two empires, one stage. To set the stage clearly. In the West, Rome, ambitious but checked, licking its wounds from Carrhae. In the East, Han China, confident, expanding into Central Asia, bringing kingdoms under its sway. Between them, the great buffered deserts, nomads, and the Parthian Empire filtering every exchange. It is in this in-between space that the mystery unfolds. Not in Rome, not in China, but in the vast middle world where their shadows touched. The power of comparison. Why does the idea of Romans in China fascinate us so much? Because Rome and Han China were equals. In a world of scattered kingdoms and tribes, they were the two giants. To imagine them brushing against one another is to imagine the meeting of two worlds, two versions of civilization, each thinking itself the center of all things. It is not just a story of soldiers. It is a story of what might have been. Foreshadowing. In the chapters ahead, we will narrow our focus again. From this grand panorama of empires, we will return to the battlefield, to Jiji, a fortress in Central Asia where Chinese annals record the strange foreign soldiers. But for now, let us hold this image in our minds. Two great empires, Rome and Han China, standing at opposite ends of the earth. Between them, deserts and silence. And in that silence, the faint echo of marching feet, a fragment of Rome carried eastward into China's gaze. Chapter 4. The Battle of Jiji 36 BCE. The mystery of the lost Roman legion is like a puzzle with missing pieces. But one piece, brighter than all the rest, lies in a dusty Chinese chronicle. It tells of a fortress under siege, of foreign warriors who fought in a strange formation, and of their defeat at the hands of Han armies. The year was 36 BCE. The place Jiji, a stronghold far out on China's northwestern frontier. And it is here, in the annals of the Han dynasty, that the whispers of Rome become almost visible. The warlord Jiji. To understand the battle, we must first understand the man who gave the fortress its name, Jiji Chanyu, a warlord of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were the great terror of China's north, a confederation of nomadic tribes who thundered across the steppes, striking like storms. They were the rivals of the Han dynasty, raiders and warriors whose horses could cross hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Jiji was a prince among them, ambitious, proud, and ruthless. After quarrels with other Xiongnu leaders, he broke away, establishing his own power base on the fringes of Central Asia. There, he built a fortified city, something unusual for nomads, who rarely stayed in one place. The city became his refuge, his stronghold, and eventually his doom. The Han Campaign. The Han dynasty could not ignore Zhiji. He threatened the fragile balance of the western frontiers, endangering the Silk Road and the vassal kingdoms under Han influence. So in 36 BCE, General Chen Tang, acting without formal imperial approval but burning with ambition, raised an army. With roughly 40,000 men, Han soldiers, and allied troops from Central Asian kingdoms, he marched west to crush Zhiji once and for all. It was a daring campaign, stretching supply lines across deserts and mountains, but Chen Tang was determined to bring back victory or not return at all. The Han army advanced on Zhiji's fortress, prepared for a siege. The fortress of Zhiji. Zhiji's fortress was no ordinary nomad camp. Chinese records describe it as a walled city with high ramparts and defensive works. Clearly, Zhiji had studied or hired builders who knew more than steppe fortifications. Inside the walls were his warriors, families, and strange mercenaries. Who these mercenaries were and where they came from is the heart of our mystery. The battle begins. The Han army surrounded the fortress, cutting off supplies. Siege engines were brought forth, ladders, battering rams, catapults. Arrows darkened the sky. Zhiji's warriors fought ferociously, but what caught the eye of the Chinese scribes was not the nomads, it was the foreigners. These men did not fight like horse archers. They fought on foot, in disciplined ranks, forming a wall of shields. The Chinese described their tactic as a yu lin zhen, a fish-scale formation. Shield overlapped shield, gleaming like scales of a giant creature. To modern eyes, the description sounds eerily similar to the Roman testudo, the tortoise formation, in which soldiers interlocked shields above and ahead, creating shell nearly impervious to arrows. Imagine the shock of Han soldiers, used to battling scattered charges of nomads, when they faced this strange living wall. The fish-scale formation. What exactly did the Chinese mean? Scholars debate it still. Some argue that the fish-scale formation was simply a local tactic, perhaps borrowed from other Central Asian peoples. Others point out that the description matches Roman methods uncannily, and that 20 years after Carrhae, survivors could indeed have been transplanted here. If they were Romans, how did they arrive at Zhiji's fortress? The most plausible theory is that they had been marched east as Parthian captives, used as mercenaries, and eventually sold or forced into service under Zhiji. They may have been few in number, perhaps only 100, but to the Han chroniclers, they were striking enough to record. The clash of arms. The battle raged for days. The Han army battered the walls, while defenders rained arrows and stones down. The foreign soldiers held their formation, resisting assault after assault. But discipline could not hold forever. The Han army had numbers, siegecraft, and determination. Bit by bit, the fortress walls were breached. The defenders fell back, fighting desperately in the streets. Zhiji himself was captured and executed, his head sent back as proof of victory. His followers were slaughtered or enslaved. And among them, the foreign soldiers were scattered, lost to history once more. What the Chinese saw. To the Chinese chroniclers, the battle was another demonstration of Han power. They noted the strange foreign warriors almost in passing, with little elaboration. To them, it was a curiosity, not a revelation. But to us, centuries later, that passing note is electrifying. For it may be the only surviving record of Romans fighting in China. Skepticism and possibility. Not all historians are convinced. Some argue that the fish-scale formation could have been anything, a phalanx-like tactic borrowed from Greeks, Persians, or Central Asians. Others warn that drawing a line from Carrhae to Zhiji is tempting but tenuous. And yet the timing fits. Carrhae was 53 BCE. Gigi fell in 36 BCE. In those 17 years, survivors could have been marched east, resettled, and found themselves in Gigi's service. Soldiers in their 30s at Carrhae would have been in their 50s, older perhaps, but still capable of fighting. The possibility is tantalizing, not certain. A ghostly glimpse. What makes the Battle of Gigi so haunting is not what we know, but what we glimpse. For one brief moment, in the records of the Han Dynasty, strange men appeared disciplined, foreign, fighting in a way no nomad ever did. And then they vanish again, like ghosts. Were they the last remnants of Crassus's legions, men who had once marched under Rome's eagle, now dying in the shadow of a fortress on China's edge? Or were they merely another band of mercenaries coincidentally using tactics that resembled Rome's? The record leaves us with questions, not answers. The survivors' fate. If they were Romans, what happened after the battle? Some say they were captured by the Han and resettled. A few Chinese sources mention foreign prisoners being moved to a frontier town called Liqian, where they may have been used to guard China's own vulnerable borders. Others argue they were slaughtered, lost in the general chaos. But the legend of Liqian and the whispers of Roman descendants there would grow in centuries to come, keeping alive the possibility that some of those foreign soldiers lived on, not just in records, but in blood. The echo of empires. The Battle of Gigi was, in Chinese history, a minor campaign, one of many victories in the endless struggle against steppe tribes. For Rome, it was nothing at all, unrecorded and unknown. And yet, for us, it is the crossroads of two empires. Rome's lost soldiers, forgotten by their own homeland, flickered for a moment in the eyes of China. It is as though, for one heartbeat of history, the grate between Rome and China narrowed, and men trained on the Tiber died on the banks of an alien river. The story lingers. History rarely offers such tantalizing maybes. Usually, we know this general died here, this empire conquered that. But here we are left with fragments. The Chinese word fish scale formation. The timing, 17 years after Carrhae. The legend, a village where Roman blood may still run. From these fragments, the story grows, fueled by curiosity, imagination, and the human desire to connect the dots. A world at the crossroads. The fall of Gigi was more than the death of a warlord. It was a sign of the shifting balance in Central Asia. Han power was extending further west, while nomads were forced to adapt. The Silk Road became more secure, allowing goods to flow more freely. And in the middle of this shifting world, we find our mystery soldiers, whoever they were, fighting in a fortress far from home. The curtain falls. When the smoke cleared at Gigi, the fortress was rubble, its defenders dead or enslaved, its ruler executed. For the Han, it was a triumph. For the Xiongnu, a disaster. For us, it is a single, fleeting glimpse of something extraordinary. An army from one end of the world, perhaps, clashing with an army from the other. And then the curtain falls. Chapter 5. The Village of Liqian. Somewhere in the arid northwest of China, hemmed in by desert and mountains, lies a small settlement that has carried a legend for centuries. A place called Liqian. At first glance, Liqian is like countless other rural villages in Gansu province. Mud brick houses, narrow lanes, fields clinging to the edges of barren land. But for centuries, Liqian has carried a story greater than its size, the claim that its people descend from Roman soldiers who vanished from history after Carrhae and reappeared somehow on China's frontier. It is a story that has stirred scholars, tourists, journalists, and adventurers alike. Some dismiss it as fantasy. Others point to fragments of evidence that suggest something tantalizingly real. Either way, Liqian has become the living symbol of the lost Roman legion's legend. The origins of the claim. Where did this idea begin that a remote Chinese village held Roman blood? The answer lies partly in the Chinese records that spoke of foreign prisoners resettled after the Battle of Carrhae in 36 BCE. Some sources suggest these captives were sent to a garrison town called Liqian, tasked with guarding the empire's vulnerable northwestern borders. Over time, the name Liqian itself became associated with distant western lands. Ancient Chinese geographers sometimes used Liqian as a term for Rome or regions to its far west. Thus, the village and the myth became entangled. If Rome was Liqian, then Liqian must be Rome. Unusual faces. For generations, travelers to the village claimed to see something different in the people there. Accounts described men and women taller than average, with aquiline noses, high-bridged features, and, occasionally, lighter eyes or hair that seemed unusual among their neighbors. Such observations fueled speculation. Could these be the descendants of Rome's lost soldiers? Had a fragment of the legions truly survived here, intermarrying with locals, blending into Chinese society while keeping some physical trace of their ancestry? To Western journalists in the 19th and 20th centuries, the story was irresistible. It was romantic, exotic, and dramatic, a Roman outpost lost in the heart of China, forgotten by its own empire but living on in blood. Science meets legend. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the story of Liqian attracted the attention of geneticists. Studies were conducted to test whether the villagers carried significant traces of European ancestry. The results were mixed. Some analyses suggested a higher-than-average incidence of certain genetic markers associated with Central Asia or Europe. Others concluded that while diversity was evident, it was not distinctly Roman, nor even definitively Mediterranean. Central Asia, after all, had been a crossroads for millennia, with Scythians, Persians, Greeks, and Turks all leaving their mark. Genetics neither proved nor disproved the Roman legend. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Yes, Liqian's people showed signs of mixed ancestry, but whose? Were they Romans, or simply products of the Silk Road's ceaseless mingling? The burden of legend. For the villagers themselves, the story has been both a burden and a boon. On one hand, it has brought tourism. Visitors arrive eager to see the descendants of Romans, to photograph faces they imagine as proof of ancient legions. Local businesses sell the legend, turning heritage into livelihood. Plays, festivals, and museums lean into the myth, making Liqian a small but significant attraction. On the other hand, it has also brought unwanted scrutiny. Villagers have sometimes been treated as curiosities, their features dissected, their identities questioned. To be told that your ancestry is not your own, that you belong not to your nation but to a story from far away, can be disorienting. And so, Liqian's people live with a double identity: Chinese citizens of the modern era, and supposed heirs of a Roman legion that vanished 2,000 years ago. Archaeological hopes. Beyond genetics and appearances, archaeology has also sought answers. Excavations in and around Liqian have uncovered remnants of Han-era structures, tools, and walls, but nothing conclusively Roman. No helmets, no shields, no inscriptions in Latin. The absence is frustrating but not surprising. If a small group of foreign soldiers were resettled here, they would not have built marble forums or carved Latin epitaphs. They would have been absorbed, their material culture erased within a generation. Wooden shields rot. Bronze buckles are melted down. The traces of Rome may have vanished in the soil. Yet the hope remains that one day a shard of unmistakably Roman origin will emerge from the earth, bridging the gap between speculation and fact. The power of names. The name Liqian itself fuels the fire. In Chinese historical geography, Lycian, sometimes referred to regions in the distant west, possibly Rome, probably regions near it. Some scholars argue that the village's name preserved the memory of where its settlers came from. Others caution that names shift over centuries, often detached from their original meaning. Lycian may have been Rome, or it may have been simply a poetic term for the faraway unknown. Still, the resonance of the name is hard to dismiss. Identity and myth. Why does the idea of Roman ancestry matter so much to both locals and outsiders? Because it connects a small, forgotten village to the grandeur of world history. To say I am descended from Romans is to claim kinship with emperors, generals, philosophers, and the eternal city itself. It transforms anonymity into legend. For outsiders, the story is equally magnetic. It suggests that history is not closed, that mysteries linger in remote corners of the world, waiting to be discovered. It is the romance of the Silk Road embodied in human faces. Skeptical voices. Historians warn against being seduced by legend. They note that Central Asia has always been home to a wide range of peoples. Greek settlers left by Alexander the Great could just as easily explain unusual features. Trade and conquest brought Persians, Turks, Mongols, and countless others through the region. Why fixate on Romans alone? They also remind us that the Han dynasty resettled many groups in frontier towns. Lycian may have been populated by foreigners, but not necessarily by the men of Carrhae. Skepticism is healthy. And yet, skepticism alone does not kill the legend. The legend as reality. Whether true or not, the story has shaped reality. Lycian today thrives on its Roman identity. Villagers dress in mock Roman armor for festivals. Tourist signs speak of China's Roman descendants. The legend has become part of the culture, woven into the identity of the place itself. Even if no Roman ever set foot in Lycian, the belief has made it so. The village has become a living monument to the possibility of Rome in China. A human thread through time. Imagine for a moment that the legend is true. That the men who fought at Gigi were indeed Romans, captured survivors of Carrhae. After their defeat, they were marched in chains once more, brought east by their Han captors, resettled in this frontier town. There, under new masters, they married local women, raised children, taught them not Latin but Chinese. Their grandchildren never knew Rome. Their great-grandchildren forgot the eagle standards. But perhaps, in the set of a jaw, in the shape of an eye, in a story whispered to a curious child, something lingered. Over centuries, Rome vanished into the soil of Lycian. But the legend endured. Between fact and faith. History demands evidence. But humans crave stories. Lycian stands at the crossroads of both. Fact: the Han resettled foreigners in frontier towns. Fact: the name Lycian was associated with the far west. Fact: the people of Lycian sometimes exhibit features unusual in the region. And yet, none of this proves Roman descent. It is a story that lives in the space between fact and faith. The continuing allure. Why does the legend of Lycian capture the imagination more than other Silk Road mysteries? Because it ties together the two greatest empires of antiquity, Rome and China, in a human way. Not through kings or trade goods, but through ordinary soldiers whose footsteps may have carried them from one end of the world to the other. It suggests that history is not neat, that the lives of forgotten men can echo across millennia, reshaping identity in ways no emperor ever planned. Looking ahead. As we leave Lycian, we carry with us both skepticism and wonder. Perhaps the villagers are indeed descended from Romans. Perhaps not. But the story is powerful regardless. And it is not the end. For even if Lycian is the most visible echo of the lost legion, there are others traces in bloodlines, in chronicles, in the silence of Rome itself. In the next chapter, we will explore the idea of bloodlines and legends more deeply, the genetics, the oral traditions, the modern fascination with ancestry, and why the story of Roman descent matters so much to identity today. Chapter 6: Bloodlines and Legends. History is written in stone and ink, but sometimes it is written in blood. For centuries, the story of Rome's lost legion in China has been less about what we can prove and more about what we want to believe. And nowhere does that desire burn brighter than in the question of ancestry. Did the Roman soldiers of Carrhae leave descendants in the east? Did their blood flow into the veins of villagers in Gansu, blending with generations of Chinese farmers and frontier folk? Or is it all illusion, a trick of memory and features, a story we tell because we long for continuity? To explore this, we must move from chronicles and battles to the more intimate realm of family lines, oral traditions, and even genetics. The allure of descent. Human beings are fascinated by origins. Nations trace themselves to founding heroes, families to noble ancestors, religions to prophets and patriarchs. To belong to a greater story gives meaning to the present. For the people of Lycian, and for those who champion the idea of Roman ancestry in China, descent from Rome is not just a curiosity, it is a claim to greatness. It ties a forgotten village on the edge of the Gobi Desert to the eternal city itself. To say, "We are the descendants of Romans," is to leap across thousands of kilometers and 2,000 years, stitching a thread that connects the humblest farmer to Julius Caesar. The evidence of features. Much of the early speculation about Roman descent came not from archaeology but from appearance. Travelers in past centuries noted that some villagers in Lycian seemed taller, with high-bridged noses, deep-set eyes, or lighter hair. Photographs from the 20th century fueled the fascination, smiling children whose faces seemed, to some eyes, more European than Asian. But appearance is slippery evidence. Central Asia has always been a meeting place of peoples. Greeks from Alexander's conquests, Persians from the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, Scythians, Huns, Mongols from the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, Scythians, Huns, Mongols all left their genetic imprint. A nose or eye color proves nothing by itself. And yet features continue to inspire the imagination. Because the human face is a mirror, and in it we long to see echoes of the past. Oral traditions. Legends often survive not in books, but in stories whispered from parent to child. In Lycian and surrounding areas, tales circulated of ancestors who came from far away, who were different, who fought in strange ways. These oral traditions rarely use the word Roman, that is, the label scholars and journalists applied, but they carry a sense of foreign origin, of being set apart. Such traditions can last astonishingly long. Across the world, families claim descent from lost tribes, from shipwrecked sailors, from conquerors and kings. Sometimes the stories are true. More often they are embroidered, shifting with each telling. But whether true or not, they shape identity. Genetic inquiries. In the modern age, science has been enlisted to probe the legend. DNA tests have been carried out among Lycian villagers, comparing their genetic markers to those of surrounding populations and to known patterns of European ancestry. The results are, like history itself, ambiguous. Some studies found higher than average frequencies of markers linked to Central Asian or even European populations. Others concluded that while diversity exists, it does not point specifically to Romans and could as easily come from centuries of migration and mixing. A few suggested that the genetic distance between Lycian villagers and other Chinese groups is not significant enough to support the Roman hypothesis. Genetics offers tantalizing hints, but no certainty. Blood does not carry flags or passports. Even if European ancestry exists in Lycian, proving it is specifically Roman is almost impossible. The romance of science. But the very attempt to test DNA speaks to how deeply the legend has captured imaginations. Science is often called upon not simply to prove facts, but to give weight to stories we already wish to believe. A villager told his grandfather's tale. A historian noted a curious phrase. A journalist took a photograph of a green-eyed child. And then came the scientists, with swabs and charts, offering the hope that blood itself could confirm what legend claimed. When the results disappointed, the legend did not die. Because legends thrive not on proof but on possibility. The identity of Lycian. For the people of Lycian, the Roman story has become part of their cultural fabric. Whether their DNA matches or not, they have embraced the myth. Festivals celebrate supposed Roman ancestry. Costumes of centurions are donned for parades. Tourists arrive eager to see the descendants of Rome. The village has turned its legend into both livelihood and pride. And identity is, in the end, a choice. If a community believes it carries the blood of Rome, then, in a sense, it does. Not because of genetics, but because identity is forged in shared memory and belief. The broader question of bloodlines. Lycian is not unique. Across the world, communities claim descent from vanished peoples. Villages in India claim ancestry from Alexander's soldiers. Tribes in Africa claim descent from the lost tribes of Israel. Families in Europe trace their bloodlines to Vikings, Normans, or Crusaders. These stories often blend truth and fiction. Soldiers did march, did intermarry, did leave traces. But time stretches and distorts the details. What begins as memory becomes legend, and what begins as legend becomes identity. The psychological pull. Why are such stories so powerful? Because they elevate the ordinary. A farmer in Gansu becomes not just a farmer, but the descendant of Rome. A child in a dusty village is not just another face, but a living link to Caesar's legions. And for outsiders, the romance is even greater. To believe that Rome touched China not through emperors or merchants but through the flesh and blood of soldiers is to believe in a world more interconnected, more mysterious, more dramatic than textbooks allow. Skepticism versus romance. Professional historians tread carefully. Without hard evidence, artifacts, inscriptions, documents, claims of Roman descent remain speculative. The discipline of history demands caution. But the human heart is not cautious. It leaps at romance, at mystery, at the idea that lost legions still live in the veins of modern people. This tension between skepticism and romance is what keeps the story alive. Were it fully proven, the tale would lose some of its magic. Were it fully disproven, it would still linger because stories are harder to kill than facts. A thought experiment. Let us imagine for a moment the soldiers themselves. Captured at Carrhae, marched east into exile, fighting at Gigi, then resettled in a Han frontier town. They marry local women. Their children grow up speaking Chinese, eating Chinese food, honoring Chinese customs. By the second generation, Rome is memory. By the third, Rome is legend. By the fourth, Rome is gone. And yet blood remembers in its silent, unprovable way. Even if their descendants never knew Latin, never marched in formation, never saw the eagle standard, the thread exists. Fragile, invisible, but real. The power of belief. Whether or not Lycian's villagers carry Roman DNA, they have chosen to carry Roman memory. And memory can be more powerful than fact. Tourists who visit Lycian do not come for statistics. They come for the thrill of standing in a place where Rome might have touched China. They come to look into the eyes of a child, And imagine Caesar's legions. They come because belief is a form of truth. Legends that shape the present. What matters, then, is not only whether the people of Latium descend from Romans, but how the legend shapes their lives today. It gives them visibility, pride, and connection. It ties them to a story that stretches beyond borders and centuries. And in doing so, it proves something profound: history is not just what happened. It is what people believe happened. The continuing mystery. Bloodlines may one day reveal more. New techniques in genetics may trace ancestry with greater precision. Perhaps future studies will confirm a Mediterranean link or erase the possibility. But even then, the legend will endure. Because the Lost Legion is not just a question of DNA. It is a symbol of how history leaks across borders, how ordinary men carry extraordinary stories, and how the past refuses to stay buried. Looking ahead. The story of bloodlines and legends is not the end, but the middle. For if Latium keeps the legend alive, Rome itself remains silent. In the next chapter, we will explore how Rome forgot while China remembered, how the silence of Roman records contrasts with the precision of Chinese annals, and how the fragility of history itself allows legends like this to flourish. Chapter 7. Rome forgets, China remembers. History is not only about what survives, but also about what is lost. And when it comes to the story of the Lost Legion, the silence of Rome is as striking as the faint echoes preserved in China. Rome, the empire of marble, chronicles, and monuments, left almost nothing about its vanished soldiers. China, the empire of scrolls, scribes, and record-keepers, left a passing but tantalizing note about strange foreign fighters. Together, these silences and fragments remind us that history is fragile, selective, and often unfair. Rome's silence. The disaster at Carrhae in 53 BCE was one of the worst defeats Rome ever suffered. 20,000 soldiers dead, 10,000 captured, and one of the triumvirs of Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, killed in humiliation. Roman historians did not ignore Carrhae itself. On the contrary, they wrote about it with grim detail. Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and others described Crassus's arrogance, the cunning of the Parthians, and the devastation of the legions. But when it comes to the survivors, the 10,000 captives marched east, the record falls silent. Why the silence? Several explanations are possible. Shame. Rome was proud. To dwell on tens of thousands of citizens enslaved by Parthia was to dwell on humiliation. Better to mourn the dead than to chronicle the living shame of captives. Civil war distraction. In the years after Carrhae, Rome was torn apart. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey was defeated. Assassinations, proscriptions, and power struggles consumed the Republic. Who cared about lost soldiers in the East when Rome itself was on fire? Distance. The Parthians resettled their prisoners far away, perhaps deliberately erasing them from Rome's reach. Without letters, ambassadors, or merchants returning with news, the captives became invisible. And so, in the annals of Rome, the Lost Legion simply vanishes. The weight of forgetting. What did this silence mean for the families left behind? Imagine being a mother in Italy whose son marched with Crassus. You hear the news Carrhae was a disaster, your son did not return. Was he dead? A captive? Still alive somewhere beyond the Euphrates? You might never know. No letters, no lists of survivors, no official word. In time, your son's name would be carved on a tombstone as if he had died, even if he lived on in exile. Rome was ruthless with memory. Victors were celebrated in triumphs, their deeds carved on stone. Losers were forgotten, their names erased. The men of Carrhae were losers, and so Rome let them slip into shadow. China's records. In contrast, the Han dynasty left records that, while sparse, preserved details Rome never did. Chinese chroniclers wrote with meticulous care. The Shiji records of the Grand Historian and the Hanshu Book of Han recorded campaigns, court intrigues, economic data, and omens with equal diligence. Where Rome celebrated deeds in marble and oratory, the Han preserved them in scrolls and ink. Thus, when General Chen Tang marched west in 36 BCE to crush the warlord Jiji, scribes noted the campaign. They recorded the siege, the capture of Jiji, and most crucially the presence of foreign soldiers fighting in a fish-scale formation. For the Han, this was just another entry in their annals. For us, it is the only surviving glimpse of what might have been Rome's lost legion. The contrast of memory. The contrast could not be sharper. Rome boasts of glory, forgets its shame. Loses thousands of men in exile, but records nothing of their fate. China records the mundane as well as the extraordinary. Notes the strange tactics of foreign soldiers, preserving a clue Rome ignored. It is as though history itself chose sides. Rome's silence buried the story. China's ink kept it alive. The fragility of sources. This contrast reminds us how fragile history is. One burned library, one lost scroll, one chronicler choosing silence, and whole peoples vanish from memory. How many other lost legions, lost villages, lost battles have disappeared simply because no one wrote them down? The story of Rome's missing soldiers survives only because a Chinese scribe 2,000 years ago found it worth noting that strange men fought in an unusual formation. Without that line of ink, the mystery would not exist at all. Selective memory. But history is not just fragile, it is selective. Both Rome and China recorded what mattered to them. For Rome, Carrhae was about Crassus's failure, about lessons in arrogance, about the balance of power with Parthia. The fate of common soldiers did not matter. For China, the Battle of Jiji was about asserting Han dominance on the frontier, about suppressing a rebellious warlord. The identity of his mercenaries was a footnote. Neither empire cared about the lost legion as we do. We see romance in the story because we live in an age that values individuals, origins, and cross-cultural connections. They did not. The silence of Rome as a theme. Rome's silence is itself part of the mystery. If Roman historians had recorded that the captives were resettled in Margiana and vanished, the story would end there. It would be sad, but not haunting. Instead, silence left a void. And into that void, imagination rushed. What if they survived? What if they marched east? What if they reached China? The absence of certainty created the space for legend. In this way, forgetting can be as powerful as remembering. China remembers, but briefly. It would be wrong to think China preserved the story with great care. The records are brief, almost indifferent. A phrase about fish-scale formation. A mention of prisoners resettled in Liqian. The Han scribes did not linger. They had no reason to. To them, these were minor details in the great tapestry of the empire. But brevity is not silence. And that brevity is enough to tantalize us today. The role of chance. Think of the odds. 10,000 Roman soldiers vanish. Parthia resettles them in distant lands. Some end up in the service of a Central Asian warlord. That warlord happens to fight the Han Chinese, whose scribes record his defeat. The scribes happen to note the foreign formation. The odds are astronomical. And yet, because of this chain of chance, we glimpse them again. Had the Han not recorded it, the story would be gone. Had Rome recorded more, the mystery would not exist. It is only because of this perfect imbalance, silence on one side, fragments on the other, that the legend breathes. The bias of empires. Rome and China remind us that empires write history not for us but for themselves. Rome glorified victories and downplayed defeats. China glorified order and recorded disruptions. Both empires filtered reality through their own priorities. We, centuries later, try to stitch their fragments into a narrative neither empire cared to tell. Memory and oblivion. The Lost Legion's story, then, is a lesson in memory and oblivion. Rome forgot. China remembered, but barely. And yet those scraps survive while countless other tales are gone forever. It makes one wonder how many mysteries lie not because they never happened, but because no one wrote them down. A modern parallel. Consider our own age. We believe we live in an era of endless information, where nothing can be lost. Yet already, digital decay erases data, biased archives preserve some voices while silencing others. Future historians may one day look back on our time and find only fragments, just as we do with Rome and China. The Lost Legion is not just a story of antiquity. It is a mirror of how history itself works, uneven, biased, fragile. Looking ahead. As we move forward in this journey, we will leave behind the silence of Rome and the brevity of China to consider what might have been. What if Rome and China had truly met, empire to empire? What if embassies had been exchanged, armies had clashed, trade had flourished without Parthian gatekeepers? What world might have been born had the two greatest empires of antiquity bridged the gap fully? The next chapter will explore this tantalizing question, the great what-if of empires that almost met. Chapter 8. Empires that almost met. Some stories capture us not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. The legend of Rome's Lost Legion touches us precisely because it suggests a fleeting connection between two worlds that never fully met, Rome and Han China. For centuries, these were the two greatest powers on Earth. Each ruled tens of millions of people, each built roads and armies, each imagined itself the center of the world. And yet, though they existed at the same time, their contact remained faint, indirect, incomplete. The story of the Legion makes us ask, what if they had truly met? What if Roman legions had marched east across the Silk Road? What if Han embassies had stood in the Forum? What if the two empires had collided, or embraced, or merged? This chapter is a meditation on that almost. The two great powers. By the 1st century BCE and into the 1st century CE, Rome and Han China were the twin giants of their age. Rome ruled from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Its legions garrisoned frontiers thousands of kilometers apart. Its aqueducts, roads, and laws knit together a diverse empire. Han China ruled from the Yellow River Plains outward, extending influence into Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia. Its bureaucracy managed agriculture, trade, and defense with astonishing sophistication. Both empires were cosmopolitan, absorbing cultures, religions, and peoples. Both projected their power through monumental architecture, coinage, and art. And both saw themselves as universal. Rome called itself the mistress of the world. China called itself the Middle Kingdom, the axis of civilization. They were mirrors of one another, never fully aware of their reflection. Indirect contact. Despite the distance, faint threads of contact did exist. Silk Roman women coveted Chinese silk, shimmering and light. Senators fretted that it weakened morals and drained gold from the treasury. Glass Chinese elites admired Roman glassware, prized for its clarity and craftsmanship. Rumors Roman texts spoke of the Seres, the mysterious silk people. Chinese annals spoke of Da Qin, a mighty kingdom in the far west. But the goods passed through countless hands: Parthian merchants, Central Asian traders, nomadic middlemen. Each link in the chain guarded its secrets, ensuring that neither Rome nor China could connect directly. The obstacles between. Why did they not meet? The obstacles were immense. Geography between Rome and China lay deserts, like the Taklamanes, like the Pamirs, an endless steppe. Crossing them was not impossible, but for large armies or embassies, it was daunting. Parthia. The Parthian Empire stood squarely between Rome and China, controlling Mesopotamia and the key arteries of the Silk Road. Parthia profited from being the middleman and had every incentive to keep Rome and China apart. Politics. Rome's energies were consumed by civil wars, then by frontier crises in Europe and the Near East. China's energies were consumed by struggles with nomads like the Xiongnu. Neither empire had the will to commit to an expedition spanning half the known world. The result: tantalizing nearness, eternal distance. Embassies that almost crossed. There were attempts, faint but real. In 97 C, the Han general Ban Chao sent an envoy, Gan Ying, westward, hoping to reach Daqin. Gan Ying made it as far as the Persian Gulf, but was warned by Parthian sailors that the sea voyage to Rome was endless and dangerous. He turned back, never reaching his destination. In 166 EC, Roman sources mention an embassy from the king of Daqin arriving in China, bringing gifts of ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shell. Chinese historians noted it too, though modern scholars suspect it may have been merchants posing as envoys. These were brief sparks in the darkness, never kindling into flame. If they had met trade. Imagine if Rome and China had established direct trade. Rome's hunger for silk was insatiable. Senators passed edicts against it, but fashion triumphed. If Roman envoys had reached China, silk might have flowed even more freely, perhaps altering the Roman economy further. China, in turn, coveted Rome's glass, fine metalwork, and exotic animals. Direct trade might have enriched both empires, reducing the power of Parthian middlemen and shifting the balance of wealth in Asia. Perhaps joint markets would have sprung up in Central Asia, bustling with Roman and Han merchants side by side. Perhaps caravan cities would have seen Latin and Chinese spoken in the same streets. If they had met war. But trade is only one possibility. War is another. Rome and China both saw themselves as universal empires. Each demanded tribute, submission, recognition of supremacy. What would have happened if ambassadors from one had stood before the other and refused to bow? Imagine Roman legions and Han armies facing off across a Central Asian plain. Roman strength-heavy infantry in disciplined formations, supported by cavalry and siegecraft. Han strength crossbowmen, cavalry trained to fight nomads, and immense logistical organization. It is impossible to say who would have triumphed. Geography alone suggests they would have fought only on the fringes, with neither empire able to sustain conquest of the other. But the clash of egos might have reshaped the world. If they had met alliance. There is also a brighter possibility: alliance. Both Rome and China shared enemies. Rome struggled with Parthia, China struggled with the Xiongnu. What if, across the miles, they had recognized common cause? An alliance of Rome and Han might have crushed Parthia, securing a direct Silk Road. The flow of goods and ideas would have increased dramatically. The world might have entered an era of even deeper interconnectedness centuries earlier. The cultural exchange that never was. Beyond trade and war lies culture. If Rome and China had met directly, what might they have exchanged? Philosophy, Confucian ethics crossing into Rome, Stoic thought crossing into China. Imagine a Roman senator quoting Confucius in the Forum, or a Han scholar debating Stoicism at court. Technology, Roman concrete, aqueducts, and engineering exchanged for Chinese paper, compasses, and advanced metallurgy. Religion. Would Buddhism, already moving from India into China, have reached Rome centuries earlier? Would Roman gods have found echoes in Chinese temples? The possibilities are endless. Why the almost matters? The fact that Rome and China never fully met makes the legend of the Lost Legion more powerful. Because in that legend, for once, the almost becomes tangible. Soldiers who began in Rome's service end up in China's chronicles. Not kings, not diplomats, not merchants, but ordinary men, carried by the currents of history farther than anyone expected. The Lost Legion is the meeting of empires reduced to human scale. The weight of distance. Ultimately, distance won. Geography and politics kept the giants apart. They circled each other like stars separated by the void. And yet, their mutual awareness, the whispers of Silk and Da-Qin, show that the desire for connection was there. Each empire sensed that beyond the horizon lay another civilization as mighty as itself. That knowledge alone shaped imagination. Rome dreamed of silk, China dreamed of a great Western kingdom, and merchants thrived on the space between. Lessons from the almost. History is filled with almosts. Alexander the Great nearly reached China but died young. The Mongols nearly conquered Europe but turned back. Rome and China nearly touched but fell short. Each almost teaches us something about the limits of empire, the fragility of ambition, and the stubbornness of geography. The story of Rome and Han China reminds us that even the mightiest powers are bounded by deserts, by mountains, by the inertia of distance. Looking ahead. The almost of empires sets the stage for what followed: the growth of myths, merchants' tales, and the human fascination with what might have been. In the next chapter, we will follow that path into myths, merchants, and memory, how stories of the Lost Legion and of Rome in the East grew along the Silk Road and beyond, becoming part of the shared imagination of civilizations. Chapter 9. Myths, Merchants, and Memory. History is never just about facts. It is about stories. And nowhere was storytelling more powerful than along the Silk Road. For centuries, caravans wound their way across deserts and mountains, carrying bolts of silk, ingots of gold, glassware, paper, and spices. But along with goods, they carried words. Tales of distant lands, of powerful kings, of exotic peoples. Traders did not just sell merchandise, they sold stories. And among those stories was the whisper that somewhere east, Rome's soldiers had not vanished, but lived on. Merchants as storytellers. Merchants were the lifeblood of the Silk Road. They linked China to Central Asia, Parthia to India, Rome to far-off markets. Yet they rarely told the truth plainly. Exaggeration was profit. Mystery was value. If a merchant could convince a buyer that silk came from magical trees in the East, the buyer would value it more highly. If glass seemed unattainably rare, its price rose. So merchants embroidered tales. They spoke of distant empires not with maps but with metaphors. And in their telling, fragments of truth were mixed with fantasy until legend was born. It was in this atmosphere that the idea of Romans in the East may have survived not as fact, but as rumor traded along with goods. The whisper of Western soldiers. Imagine a merchant in Samarkand or Kashgar. He has seen perhaps strange mercenaries fighting in formation for a Central Asian warlord. Or he has heard a story from his father about foreign soldiers taken by Parthians and marched east. He tells his customer, "There are men from the farthest west who fight in lines like walls of iron. They came from beyond the deserts, beyond the great sea. Some call them men of Da-Qin." The listener does not need proof. The image is enough. The story travels with the caravan, passed from tongue to tongue, growing stranger with every telling. The role of memory. In the absence of official records, memory filled the gap. Local peoples remembered strange soldiers who once guarded their lands, or villages of foreigners who spoke oddly, or mercenaries who built walls unlike any they had seen. These memories survived in scraps, legends of men who came from far away, of ancestors who were not like others. Over generations, the details blurred, but the core remained a sense of foreignness, of descent from the West. Such memories are powerful. They shape identity even when evidence fades. The Roman mirage in the East. For the Chinese, Rome Daqin was half real, half mirage. Their records described it as a vast empire of cities and riches, a mirror of their own civilization in the far West. For the Romans, China the Sarahs was equally hazy, known only through silk and rumor. And in between lay the middle world of merchants, who turned these mirages into living stories. Rome in the East became a tale of soldiers in far-off fortresses, of descendants in remote villages, of Western warriors who had lost their empire but not their discipline. The appeal of the story. Why did this particular legend survive when so many others faded? Because it had all the elements of a perfect tale. Tragedy: soldiers captured and exiled far from home. Mystery: their fate uncertain, their trail vanishing into the desert. Exoticism: Rome and China, two worlds apart, brushed against each other. Continuity: descendants still alive, living proof of the story. Such tales are irresistible. They appeal to curiosity, to longing, to the universal desire to believe that nothing is ever fully lost. Merchants and memory keepers. Merchants did not just spread goods, they preserved memory. A trader might pass down stories from father to son along with business routes. In places like Bactria, Sogdiana, and Gansu, such stories may have survived for centuries. A village might say, "Our ancestors came from the West." A caravan guide might claim, "Those men who guard the passes, they are Romans." Even if untrue, the repetition gave the legend life. The medieval echoes. Centuries later, when the Silk Road was still thriving, echoes of these legends appeared in medieval texts. Arab geographers, Persian chroniclers, and even European travelers repeated strange tales of distant lands where formed among locals, where Rome and China touched. Some of these were surely distorted memories of the lost legion. Others were inventions, spun from the timeless human urge to connect distant worlds. But the fact that echoes survived at all shows how deeply the story had sunk into Silk Road culture. The legend in Liqian. The most enduring echo, of course, was in Liqian itself. There, the legend became localized, rooted in place. The story was no longer about Rome and China in the abstract, but about us, our ancestors, our blood, our village. Local pride and memory fused with merchant tales and Chinese records. Over centuries, Liqian became the symbolic heart of the Lost Legion's story, the place where memory and myth embraced. Myths as survival. Myths often preserve what facts cannot. A story repeated for centuries, even if distorted, can keep alive the memory of an event long after documents are lost. The legend of the Lost Legion may be just such a myth. Even if the details are wrong, it may preserve the faint memory of real soldiers who once marched east, fought under foreign masters, and left descendants who remembered only that their ancestors came from afar. The merchant's gift. We should not underestimate the merchants of the Silk Road. They were not just carriers of silk and spice, they were carriers of imagination. Without them, the story of Rome and China might have vanished entirely. But because they told and retold tales of strange soldiers, of Daqin and the Sarahs, of distant ancestors, the legend survived. In this sense, merchants gave us more than goods. They gave us the memory of connection, the power of rumor. In history, rumor can be as powerful as fact. Rome never knew China directly, yet Romans dreamed of the Sarahs. China never met Rome directly, yet the Han recorded Qin. Neither had certainty, but both had stories. The Lost Legion lives in that same space between fact and rumor, between certainty and imagination. And it is precisely there, in that twilight of truth, that stories endure longest. Why the memory matters. The legend of Rome in China reminds us of something fundamental, that people long to believe the world is smaller, more connected, more dramatic than it seems. Merchants and storytellers gave audiences what they craved, the idea that empires touched, that soldiers traveled farther than maps allowed, that ancestry stretched across deserts and oceans. The legend survived because it answered a deep human hunger. Looking ahead. As we leave the realm of merchants and memory, we come to the present. For the legend has not died, it has only grown. Scholars, tourists, novelists, and villagers all continue to keep it alive. But why? Why do we want to believe so fiercely in a story with so little proof? In the next chapter, we will explore the power of a mystery, why unsolved questions captivate us, and why the Lost Legion endures not in spite of uncertainty, but because of it. Chapter 10: The Power of a Mystery. Some stories survive because they are true. Others survive because they might be true. The legend of the lost Roman legion in China belongs to the second category. It is not confirmed fact, yet it refuses to die. Like a desert mirage, it shimmers on the horizon of history, never close enough to grasp, never far enough to forget. But why? Why does a faint line in a Chinese chronicle, a handful of unusual faces in a village, and a silence in Roman records captivate us so deeply? The answer lies not in the facts, but in the power of mystery itself. Mystery as invitation. A mystery is an invitation. It asks us to lean forward, to fill the gaps, to imagine. History, when complete, can be comforting but static. We know who won, who died, who built, who fell. But when a gap opens, when something vanishes into silence, it draws us in. We become participants, detectives, storytellers. The Lost Legion is such a gap. 10,000 men vanish from Roman records, only to flicker in Chinese scrolls. Between those two fragments stretches a desert of possibility. That desert invites us to walk across it, building bridges of imagination. The human hunger for connection. At its heart, the story of the Legion is about connection. Two of the greatest civilizations in history, Rome and Han China, stood at opposite ends of the world. Each believed itself supreme, universal. And yet, they never truly touched. The thought that they might have brushed against one another, even through the footsteps of a few lost soldiers, is irresistible. We long for such connections because they make the world feel smaller, more unified, more dramatic. They remind us that history is not a series of isolated chambers, but a web of intersections. The Legion is a thread that seems to stitch East and West together. Whether true or not, the idea satisfies our hunger to believe the world has always been interconnected. The beauty of uncertainty. Certainty closes doors. Mystery keeps them open. If archaeologists tomorrow uncovered a Roman helmet in Gansu, inscribed with a legion's name, the legend would become fact. It would be fascinating, but it would also lose some of its allure. If DNA testing proved beyond doubt that Lycian's people are not descended from Romans, the legend would collapse into disappointment. But as long as the question remains unanswered, the story breathes. The lack of proof is not a weakness, it is the source of its power. Romance in the ordinary. Another reason the story endures is that it is not about emperors or generals, but about ordinary soldiers. The men who marched with Crassus were not senators or philosophers. They were farmers' sons, craftsmen, men who signed up for pay and adventure. They fought, they lost, they were captured. And yet their possible journey became the bridge between empires. There is romance in the idea that forgotten men, not kings, carried history across continents. That ordinary soldiers, not by choice but by fate, became the first Romans to reach China. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped from above but also from below, in the footsteps of men whose names never appear in marble. The comfort of continuity. Legends of ancestry, like those in Lycian, speak to a deep desire, the belief that nothing is truly lost. That even when empires fall, when records vanish, when names are forgotten, something continues. The idea that Roman blood still flows in distant veins comforts us. It says the past is not dead, it lives in us. This continuity, whether real or imagined, binds us to history. It makes the fall of Carrhae not just a defeat long ago, but a living story still unfolding in human lives. Mystery as identity. For the people of Lycian, the legend of Roman descent has become part of their identity. Whether or not it is biologically true, it is culturally true. It shapes how they see themselves and how the world sees them. This shows another power of mystery. It can create reality. A story repeated long enough becomes part of who we are, whether it began as fact or imagination. Why we want to believe. Why do we want the lost legion to be true? Because it satisfies multiple human desires at once. Adventure. The image of soldiers marching into the unknown. Connection. The union of East and West, Rome and China. Survival. The belief that nothing vanishes completely, that echoes endure. Romance. The transformation of ordinary soldiers into legendary figures. It is a perfect story, not because it is proven, but because it resonates. The risk of overbelief. And yet there is danger too. Myths can overshadow truth. Scholars warn that chasing romantic theories can blind us to more complex realities. The people of Central Asia were diverse long before Romans arrived. To attribute every unusual feature to Roman blood oversimplifies a rich tapestry of migrations. To cling too tightly to the legion myth risks erasing the true histories of others. Mystery is powerful, but it must be handled with care. The role of imagination. Still, imagination has its place. Without it, history is a dry list of names and dates. With it, history becomes alive, dramatic, human. The Lost Legion story invites us to imagine. The clink of Roman armor in a Parthian caravan. The weary march across Central Asian plains. The astonishment of Chinese soldiers facing a wall of foreign shields. The quiet lives of descendants farming fields in Gansu, never knowing their ancestors' homeland. These images may never be proven, but they enrich our sense of the past. Why the story endures today. In the modern world, where borders are rigid and identities contested, the Lost Legion offers something rare, a story of unexpected mingling. It tells us that even 2,000 years ago, people traveled farther than we think, cultures collided in unexpected ways, and history was more global than we imagine. In a sense, the Legion is a parable for globalization before globalization. The echo of ghosts. The story also endures because it is ghostly. It is about men who vanish, only to flicker on the edge of another empire's vision. It is about absence, silence, and faint echoes. Ghost stories are compelling not because they are clear, but because they are unclear. The Lost Legion is a ghost story of history. Mystery as a bridge. Finally, mystery connects us to the past not as observers, but as participants. When we wonder about the Legion, we are not just reading history, we are helping to write it. We speculate, imagine, argue, and in doing so we keep the story alive. The Legion lives not in bones or scrolls, but in the minds of those who ask what if. Looking ahead, the power of mystery is not the end of our story, but the penultimate step. For the legend does not live only in speculation. It lives also in the modern world, in Lichian's festivals, in tourism, in scholarship, in the identity of people today. In the epilogue, we will return to Lichian and the steppe. We will see how the story survives in the present, how it shapes identity, and how echoes of Rome still linger under the Chinese sky. Epilogue echoes on the steppe. The desert at dusk is quiet. Winds sweep across the Gobi, carrying dust and memory. The stars emerge one by one, the same stars that once shone down on Roman camps along the Rhine and Han fortresses on the frontier. And somewhere in this vastness lies Lichian, the little village that has become the symbol of a story larger than itself. A story of soldiers who vanished from Rome's records only to flicker from in China's chronicles and to live on in legend. Lichian today. In modern times, Lichian is not just a village. It is a stage. Tourists arrive, cameras in hand, eager to see the descendants of Romans. Local festivals feature men in gleaming armor fashioned after Roman centurions, marching in formation for amused visitors. Children laugh, elders smile, and the legend is performed like theater. Shops sell trinkets linking Lichian to Rome. Museums display artifacts, some genuine Han relics, some reconstructed props alongside panels explaining the possibility of Roman ancestry. Tour guides repeat the tale, half history, half myth. For the villagers, it is a source of pride, a livelihood, and a curiosity. Some embrace it. Others shrug. But whether they believe it or not, the legend is part of their lives. The scholars debate. Meanwhile, scholars continue to argue. Some say the case is weak, no definitive Roman artifacts, no conclusive DNA. Others insist the pieces fit too well: the timing of Carrhae, the mention of the fish scale formation, the resettlement of foreigners in Lichian. The debate has filled conferences, journals, and popular books. Each new study, each new excavation adds fuel to the fire, but never quite settles it. And perhaps it never will. Echoes in identity. For the people of Lichian, the truth may matter less than the story. Identity is not only what we inherit, but what we choose to believe. If a community believes it is descended from Romans, then in a cultural sense, it is. The legend shapes how they are seen by outsiders, how they see themselves, and how their village fits into the grand narrative of history. To claim descent from Rome is to say we are connected to the great currents of the past. We are not forgotten. We are part of the story of empires. The ghost of the Legion. Imagine for a moment those soldiers at Carrhae. They marched under the eagle, proud and disciplined. Then came defeat, capture, exile. They trudged eastward, step by weary step, until Rome was a memory behind them and unknown lands stretched ahead. They could not know that 2,000 years later people would still wonder about them. That their fate would become a mystery captivating scholars, villagers, and tourists alike. That their story would be retold not as tragedy alone, but as legend. The Legion became ghostly, but ghosts linger. History's fragile web. The tale of the Lost Legion teaches us about history itself. It shows us how fragile the web of memory is. A few lines in Chinese annals, a name on a map, a handful of oral traditions, that is all that remains. And yet from those scraps we weave entire worlds of speculation. It is a reminder that countless other stories have been lost entirely, swallowed by silence. The legion survives not because it is unique, but because chance allowed it a faint echo. The power of place. Standing in Lichien today, one feels that echo. Not because the villagers' look Roman features are too ambiguous, too mingled, but because the place itself carries the weight of story. The earth beneath one's feet has been tilled for centuries. Generations have lived and died here. Perhaps among them were the descendants of soldiers who once carried Roman shields. Perhaps not. But the possibility gives the soil a kind of resonance. History is often less about certainty than about atmosphere. Lichien has atmosphere in abundance. The eternal allure of lost armies. Human history is filled with lost armies. Pharaohs marched into deserts and never returned. Crusaders vanished into storms. Explorers disappeared into jungles. But Rome's lost legion in China is different. It is not just about loss, but about connection, the idea that an army marched so far, across such unimaginable distances, that it brushed the edge of another world civilization. That is why the story endures. It is not simply tragedy. It is contact, however faint, between fact and legend. So where do we stand? Fact: Carrhae was a disaster. 10,000 Romans were captured. Fact: Parthians resettled prisoners far east. Fact: Chinese annals describe foreign soldiers fighting in a fish-scale formation in 36 BCE. Fact: some prisoners were resettled in a town called Lichien. Beyond that, it is legend. Did those soldiers in the fish-scale formation come from Rome? Were the settlers of Lichien their descendants? We do not know. But legend fills the silence. And legend itself becomes part of history. Why the story matters. In the end, the story of the Lost Legion matters less for what it proves than for what it symbolizes. It symbolizes the interconnectedness of the ancient world. It symbolizes the fragility of memory. It symbolizes the way ordinary people, forgotten by their own empires, can live on in legend. Most of all, it reminds us that history is not just a chain of certainties, but a landscape of mysteries. The desert at dusk. And so we return to the image with which we began: the desert at dusk. A column of men marches east, their armor dented, their sandals worn thin. Behind them, Rome, a world they will never see again. Ahead of them, China, a world they cannot yet imagine. They are silent, weary, disciplined still. They march not into victory, not into triumph, but into mystery. And 2,000 years later, we still follow their footsteps in the sand, wondering where they led. Final reflection. The Lost Legion may never be found. Its bones may lie scattered in deserts, its shields rusted to dust, its blood long mingled with others. But its story is alive. It lives in Lichien's festivals. It lives in Chinese annals. It lives in the silence of Rome. It lives in the imagination of all who wonder what became of the men who marched east and vanished. History gives us many answers, but the Lost Legion gives us something rarer, a question that never dies. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all.